There's a future where your doctor no longer burns out filling out forms, where your DNA isn't locked in a lab, but working in your favor, and where AI doesn't replace your humanity, it protects it. We're not there yet, but today we'll glimpse it. My guest, Dr. Mark Bouzyk, a scientist, entrepreneur, and builder of science revolutions. He's helped map the human genome, sequenced the DNA of over 1 million veterans, and quietly built the digital systems that may soon redefine medicine, not just with data, but with dignity. The conversation today will take you behind the curtain into the labs and algorithms and the moral imagination of a man who sees not just what medicine is, but what it could become. You'll learn how AI, genomics are converging to serve patients, protect physicians, and, well, rehumanize care. And more than that, you'll hear the kind of question that lingers long after the science fades. What kind of system would we build if we truly believed every genome matters? Let's find out. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Mark Bouzyk, a renowned scientist, entrepreneur, and innovator in genomics, AI-driven healthcare, and precision medicine. He co-founded Kesogen Inc., a leading genomics company, later acquired by Tempus Labs, and is currently the president and chief strategy officer and co-founder of AllaiHealth Inc., revolutionizing clinical workflows through AI-powered diagnostics. Mark has held key roles institutions like Emory University, GlaxoSmithKline, Cancer Research UK, PhD in human molecular genetics from the University of Hertfordshire. His experience spans population genetics, pharmacogenetics, AI in healthcare, and digital health innovation, shaping the future of personalized medicine and clinical decision making. That is a mouthful. Dr. Mark Bouzyk, welcome to the DNA of Things.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Pleasure to be here, and hopefully we'll have a great conversation.
Hopefully, indeed. Our relationship spans, many years or several years. I remember working with you during my time with Athletigen. Specifically, I was introduced to you, I believe, by Jennifer Lesclett, if you can believe it, from...
Yes.
From... they were acquired by Thermo Fisher. It was, what was the name of the company? Affymetrix.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I was introduced to a Kesogen at the time.
Yeah, she's a great person. She then went to work with Ruby Gadler at MDisrupt, actually. So that's where she's currently based. So I keep in touch with her as well. She's a wonderful person.
Amazing. And I mean, a Kesogen, that maybe that's a good place to start. I want to make sure we spend a good amount of time insofar as what you got going on with AllaiHealth, because that seems to be really an exciting initiative. But interested in obviously the Kesogen Tempus acquisition, because that is really, let's just say, indicative of where the genomics revolution is going, if you will, as it relates to the hardware. But maybe even before that, if you could shed a light on, how you made that jump from academia to industry. Think of this as like the hero's journey, and you're the hero. So if you could share a little bit about your, let's say, early days, I think that'd be great context for our listeners to understand. So over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So having graduated UCL, etc., my first job actually was in virology, and I worked at the World Health Organization Influenza Center in London. And I'm going back to the 80s now. And so we worked on structure-function relationships of influenza viruses, and also something called HTLV3, which is now known as HIV. So we got the first viruses from Luc Montagnier's lab and started doing the work. So that's when I really got excited to learn about how viruses function, particularly RNA viruses like influenza, etc. And even there was a lab next door to us that worked on coronavirus, would you believe? And that's back in the 80s.
Wow.
And so very interesting times. Was very fortunate to work with some very pioneers in that space, and that really got my interested in all things genomics, if you will. So from there, I moved to Cancer Research UK, worked on signal transduction, and was fortunate to work alongside, we're now considered pioneers in things like yeast genetics, and learn from great people who are now Nobel laureates. An example there is Sir Paul Nurse, a great man and great pioneer in yeast genetics. And so from there, I sort of got into what was called the Eurogem project, and really that was all about networking genetics labs across Europe to help build the scaffold for the human genome before it was sequenced. So we were doing things like genetic mapping, radiation hybrid mapping. So I was mapping genes to parts of the chromosome, creating scaffolds in order for the human genome to actually be published back in the day. And this is late 90s, and then it was published, the first draft was published at the start of, I think, 2001. Also was involved in other projects, and there was a race to clone genes in those days. BRCA1 had already been done, but I was sort of partially involved in the race to clone BRCA2. So that's how far back I go. That's way before anything, that would be a PhD project back in the day, but now it's, pretty common. So really, I've spent most of my career sequencing data at the World Health Organization Influenza Center at Cancer Research UK. And then how did I jump from an academic government lab, if you will, to industry? So George Post, who was chair of R&D at SmithKline Beecham, decided he wanted to do something called genomics-driven medicine. And in 1996, no big pharma was doing anything in genomics. So basically, George Post hired Peter Goodfellow, who was the youngest chair of human genetics at Cambridge University in England, and asked him to create a genetics department. So I was sort of pulled into that initiative and joined SmithKline Beecham to start genetics going, because he believed that, instead of in drug development, if you want to, you do hit to lead and all these things, and then you find a disease for the drug, let's say sem-transmembrane receptor entity that the drug could interact with, and then you put a disease to it. But he wanted to do front-driven genomics, and so what we did were the first ever GWAS studies, because no one else could afford it at the time, and we did case control for all common diseases, and we just looked at various SNPs and see if we could find associations in potential drug targets. And so we only looked at kinases and sem-transmembrane receptor genes. And if we found it some kind of hit, that would go to, could go to respiratory, could go to oncology, could go to whatever department, so they could start doing the drug discovery. But that never really worked out because it was early days. And where pharmacogenetics actually benefits pharma these days, where genetics benefits in these pharma in these days, is in pharmacogenetics, so the right drug for the right person. And that's where we got some notable hits, and we, especially with abacavir, one of GSK's drugs, having merged with SmithKline Beecham, merging with GlaxoWellcome in the year 2000, basically we decided to show the world, or Alan Roses, who was my boss at the time, said, we're going to show the world pharmacogenetics works. So we took one of our drugs for HIV, abacavir, and looked for the 4% of people who take that drug for HIV get a nasty adverse reaction. They get skin rash, etc. And so we went out to try and find out the genetics of these people who have this adverse event. It took us a matter of weeks to find the SNP in the HLA region, and then we went through the clinical trials. And so eventually the FDA basically regulated it as a genetic test, and it got FDA approval about 8 to 10 years after the initial discovery. And that was the second one that a drug was relabeled for pharmacogenetics after warfarin. And now there's roughly about 200 plus on the FDA website. So pharmacogenetics has taken a lot of time. It's taken 2-3 decades to get there, but slowly and surely, these things take time, but they do get there in the end. So I spent 9 years at GSK, and then that was, a great learning for me. And then I took a leap of faith, and because I love to build things, as you can already tell, I moved my family when I was in my mid-40s to the US to work at Emory University and set up the Center for Medical Genomics there and really get that going from a cottage industry to in developing genetic tests for rare genetic disorders such as lysosomal diseases, Gaucher-Fabry, etc. And in the end, over a period of time, we turned that from a cottage industry into a really functioning lab that morphed into Emory Genetic Labs, which was ironically eventually acquired by Eurofins. So it became Eurofins EGL. So that was one of the things I did at Emory. Another one was help them get the NCI designation, which was a big deal in the state of Georgia. There were no entities, no hospitals or schools of medicines that had that NCI designation. And so with my cancer background, I helped them attain that. And those are my two kind of achievements in my 6-year tenure at Emory University. And so then I took my next leap of faith and decided to move out of Emory, comfy job, etc., and go into the startup world. And everybody thought I was crazy. Why do you want to do it? And Steve Warren, who's my boss at the time, said, "Now's a good time to do it. This is 2010 now. This is just after the 2008, when we had that kind of recession." And basically what I wanted to do is take all my learnings that I've learned over the years and put it into a company where we would really sort of create a multi-omics entity and service lab for the community, not only in Atlanta and the US, but globally as well. And so we got involved in a whole array of different areas as a service lab. So we were involved in doing methylation studies, doing studies, classic sequencing, genotyping primarily with all the platforms, and the microbiome as well as the epigenetics. And so we actually built the company from scratch, from grants and contracts, and we didn't take on any money, although we were offered a ton of money to do this entity. But because we got some very large contracts, we didn't really need to do that. And one notable contract that we did get was with the VA, the Million Veterans program, which is still ongoing. And so basically we genotyped, the idea was just to genotype 1 million US veterans on an array that had roughly 800,000 SNPs to really understand the VA population and help the VA population and do population genetics. And so we were the data generators on that. This was a 5-year multi-million-dollar contract, and the biggest at the time by population. Actually, it's still the largest ever project in the world, and it's still ongoing. And the VA decided to say, we've hit 1 million volunteers now. Let's not stop. Let's go to 2 million. And that's where they're going right now, out of the 8 to 9 million veterans in the US. And as you can imagine, 90% of the population is male as opposed to female, but which we prove genetically, if you will. And then I persuaded the VA to look outside of DNA and look at epigenetics as well. So we did the world's largest epigenetics project, which was at the time looking somewhere between 50 and 100,000 veterans and doing DNA epigenetic profiling on CPG sites with the EPIC array from Illumina. And they were great days. And there are literally hundreds of papers now coming out as a basis of all that work. And the work continues at Tempus today. And it was a great revenue generator for us, which allowed us to go into other areas, such as in the clinic to develop CLIA-based tests. And the one we did primarily was risk profiling for cancer, 50 cancer genes, and doing reports. So we got into that space. We also got into the microbiome space, where we supported a lot of labs across the country and big entities who are trying to use microbiome developed drugs, if you will. And so we were just the data generators there as well, so to speak. So doing multi-omics at large scale allowed us to scale up our sequencing efforts as well, using both the major platforms of the day, primarily short reads. And it was an amazing 10 years where we grew the company took little or no money on. And so we were in a fortunate position. And then Tempus came along. During this 10-year period, we were approached by numerous companies who wanted to acquire us, but we always said no because we didn't see the fit. But then Tempus came along, and Eric Lefkowski started Tempus AI, as it's called now, because his wife had breast cancer, and he couldn't understand why data-driven AI approaches were not being used in healthcare, whereas they were being used in other industry sectors. So he basically founded Tempus, put $100 million of his own money into this because he's a billionaire, and he raised a total of about $1.4 billion over a 4 or 5 year period, and wanted to really grow the infrastructure. So they're headquartered in Chicago. They wanted other labs. They came across us. They liked what they saw, and their thesis is, do we build it or do we buy it? And they liked what we were doing in cancer. They were mainly in cancer at the time. And so they also were interested in some of our direct-to-consumer efforts, like we were doing with Athletigen. And we got to know all the direct-to-consumer companies, funnily enough, more than 200 plus, and worked with maybe up to 50 or so. And they were interesting times. But coming back to Tempus was interesting because the deal went through very smoothly, and we stayed on. And this was just before COVID, so we were acquired in December 2019, and then all hell broke loose in February, March, April 2020 when COVID reached the US. And so we decided internally, as Bob and I, my co-business partner, who was CEO of Gen, we said we're going to develop a COVID test to test our people in the lab, because we don't want them going down, and we need to keep this testing up. And so we were fortunate enough to get a test up and running really quickly. And then we saw a bigger market for this. And so we started going after government contracts and really, looking at expanding what we were doing in COVID testing. And at the same time, the lab in Chicago started doing this kind of testing as well. And we got some very significant contracts with CVS as an example. So the contract with CVS was interesting because they were in 13 different states, and we would have flights coming into Atlanta on a daily basis, and we were doing up to 7,000 tests a day. So literally, it was one of the biggest challenges in my career. In 2 months, we hired 20 people, did all the accessioning and did the qPCR kind of tests for COVID. And all in all, we must have done in our lab at least 1 million tests at the height of COVID. Interestingly enough, people always talk about what are the fancy instruments you need to do, because everybody imagines that's where the bottleneck is. The bottleneck actually is when you get the sample in and you accession it, and you have to unpack it and check the barcode and double check it and have cameras on people so it doesn't get mixed up. So we had an army of people at the front end, and that's really where the bottleneck was. So they were fun times, and Bob and I, stayed on for that 20 months.
Wow.
And then the next thing that happened was we decided to part ways with Bob and I with, it's been really great having you here, and, it's been a great match for us. And now Tempus has expanded into different areas, and they went IPO in June last year, and they're valued at today at least over $10 billion. So the company grew from, let's say, 400 people when we were acquired to over 2,000 people today. And it's the kind of company that they will build a plane while they're flying it, kind of thing, So very fast-paced company, very exciting, doing novel things outside of cancer now, and with their recent acquisition of Emory Genetics, moving into other areas. The one area I didn't touch on in Akisgen, which was one of our fortes, was doing this direct-to-consumer testing. And so we were doing testing from anything from athletics, genes, let's say, to nutrition, where people would use the genes to, suggest supplements, the companies, to ancestry. And so if you look at every single every single direct-to-consumer genetics company in the US, everyone from the mom and pop shops to 23andMe to Ancestry, none of them have their own labs. They all outsourced to labs like ourselves at the time, or LabCorp. So we really got an interesting picture on where direct-to-consumer genetics is going. And if you really look at it, there's not one company I really know today, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, that's really made money in direct-to-consumer genetics. It's about everything other than that, whether you're selling a supplement or something along those lines, where they make their money, or if they do a data grab and get consent to use your data for research. And so 23andMe, for example, partnered with GSK, who wanted to look at all sorts of other data, and paid them $300 million for one of their projects, and so on and so forth. So to make money, it's a means to an end to collect the data and really just offer the test essentially at cost, because you're not really going to make it there. So the next thing that happened was moving. When we had our last conversation with Eric, he said to us, Mark, Bob, think of a big idea for your next big thing, because I like to think big. Please do not do another sequencing company, because they're all over the place. Think of something big that you can do in healthcare. And so I thought about this, and I thought, AI is essentially a commodity. Machine learning, LLMs, and so on and so forth. And most people agree with me that that's a commodity. Generating data, it's the first to the bottom. Sequencing data, genotyping data is now becoming a commodity, and whole genome sequencing, more and more people are gravitating towards that. In fact, Tempus announced at JP Morgan this year that they're moving full throttle to doing whole genome sequencing for all their cancer and other patients, and kind of moving away from targeted sequencing, because that is really going to become the norm. So that was, to me, was, very interesting. And so Bob and I took like a 3-month break, thought about what we should do next. And we thought, how can we help fix the US healthcare system? And we started to look at these new digital companies that were out there. And I've spent all my life generating data. And now we thought, well, what are the issues in essentially, what are the issues going on in the healthcare system? And we saw that there's inefficiencies in documentation, and physician burnout, and frustration from patients having to fill in endless forms, and insurance not being collected properly, and so on and so forth. And so there are many companies out there today that have tried to solve part of this, but they're just doing an administrative intake using digital technology. What we decided to do was do a clinical intake to make a clinical decision tree. And we started and we looked at all the common ailments out there. And the US spends about $4.2 to $4.5 trillion a year in healthcare. And the biggest spend happens to be in MSK, musculoskeletal disorders, ortho, etc. And would you believe that costs more to do that than cancer and heart disease combined, which I found was astonished by. So anyway, we started with ortho, and what we did was we developed something called a digital. After building our team, we started to set up and work with MSK and orthopedic surgeons and specialists to build a digital clinical interview, as we call it, which is really a smart questionnaire based on conditional logic and decision trees. So there may be 100 questions in this form. You answer the questions, what's your main reason for being here? And then it goes through a lot of clinical decisions. If you're a man, it's not going to ask you, are you at menopausal age, and so on and so forth. So out of the 100 questions, you may only answer 20 to 30. And it takes someone typically between 8 and 11 minutes to fill in the form. And there's an avatar as part of it. So you click on the avatar where the pain is, and so on and so forth, and how do you rate the pain, and et cetera, et cetera. And so at the end of it, you get something called HPI, History of Present Illness, and you fill the form in at home. So once you've contacted the doctor, they'll send you the form to fill in on your tablet, computer, whatever, and then it's uploaded to the physician. And so the physician actually, instead of having a discovery process with you, saves 30 to 50% of their time, because they have a form that basically is written in prose or bullet form, depending on how the physician likes it, based on AI. And it's going to say something like, John, age 42, has pain between L3, L4, pain radiates down the left leg, has numbness of toes, has had no recent issues with falling down or whatever it may be. So you give them something like that, which will help them get to a differential diagnosis, or what are the next steps for treatment, be it an MRI or other imaging, it's so on and so forth. So that's one component of what we have, and that was developed by physicians for the physicians, and the physicians love it, and it's currently being tested in some major clinics across the country, and it uses ambient AI, so it'll take to record the conversation as based on the TCI during the patient visit, and that information is fed back into the electronic health record, where the doctor can take notes or not take notes or tweak it however they want to do. And then the final thing it does is we have an algorithm where things that doctors hate to do is billing and coding for billing. In other words, is this a 3? Is this a 4? Is this a 5? The 5 is highly complex. A 3 may be moderate. And so a 3 may be a CPT code that costs $70. A 5 may be $150 or whatever it might be. So we've shown that this is very accurate, and we provide those codes to create this augmented note that goes in to the EHR, suggests the coding. And so it basically saves the physician a lot of so-called pajama time, as it's called. They don't basically have to spend time on evenings and weekends writing up notes. It's all there for them. And, it's been a very, very impressive tool to date. So we started with MSK. The company's been going for 2.5 years, and we've really want to knock MSK out of the park. And now we're looking to be working with somewhere between 200 and 500 physicians and selling this product on a SaaS basis. In regards to genomics and genetics, you can see I'm not talking about that. However, I envisage that at some point, people may say this could be osteoporosis. So let's do an osteoporosis genetic test, for example, and so on and so forth. So there will be other add-ons as time moves forward. So the next idea is, because of the way the software has been designed, it allows you to add in other common ailments. And so our next ones in line is women's health, urology, cardiology, oncology, and so on and so forth. And so this thing is going to morph and build over time, with the ultimate goal in, let's say, 5 years for this product to eventually get to PCPs. Because at the moment, if I'm a physician, a general practitioner, I can get in. Someone will come in with a earache, or someone may come in because they've twisted their leg, or someone may come in for a respiratory thing, or whatever it might be. But this product will be designed so they can use it to better refer patients and help healthcare. So this is overall, it's saving physicians time. Some of the metrics I'll give you is, it's really interesting to see that we get an 86% uptake of people filling in the forms, because sometimes people go, I don't want to fill in yet another form. It's going to take me 15 minutes. But 86% of people fill in the form before they get to the physician. So the physician doesn't have to have a discovery, session. It's all about, okay, we've got really good information with you. I've got additional EHR on you, and we can just take this thing forward. So that's one other thing. Another interesting fact that I learned was that, 90% of back operations in the US are actually unnecessary, and they're more elective than anything else. And so we can help provide alternatives, such as, do you need physical therapy or not, and so on and so forth. However, that doesn't rule out, not doing those operations, but it kind of gives an enriched guidance for physicians and patients to make decisions together on their health and outcomes. And ultimately, where this is going to prove beneficial is the return on investment. We're going to be taking money that's left on the table for the clinic, so they're going to also make money, but also save time as well for the physicians. And as I said, we measured that between a 30 and 50% saving on their time. So if they wanted to, they could see more patients or have better quality time, and so on and so forth. So very exciting. And yeah, so that's AllaiHealth in a nutshell. And it is coming back to Eric Lefkowski's point, it is a big nut to crack because you can't do everything at once. Some people just focus on one aspect of form filling, and other people are like admin forms, like they take your insurance down. And how many times have you been in it, or I've been in a clinic where you're filling in forms and you don't understand half the lingo and it's all paper and so on and so forth, and bringing this in and not upsetting the current workflow has been what we've learned. I'll stop there, Jeremy. I know I've been going on a bit too long. Probably you may have other questions you may want to ask me.
No, that was a good riff. So I really appreciate that background. It was a really good stream. And, if I can, find some, moments in the conversation, if I think just kind of through, temporally stitch some of these things together. So maybe I'll begin with the end here where you started. Well, this gives physicians, let's say 30% of their time back. So they may choose to see more patients. And so ease more suffering. Or you know what? Maybe they won't burn out, right? And maybe they're have 10 years longer in the field, in the industry, and their career. I read an interesting fact recently. Let's just call it opinion because I don't have the receipts, but I remember reading somewhere like it was like 65 to 75% of practitioners that's in the medical field would not recommend their chosen discipline to the next generation, so to speak, basically, and indicating the reason for that being burnout and being, let's just say, being overworked and being oversubscribed. So that's a really interesting, kind of value proposition that you're providing there by taking care of some critical component of the administration and getting the information in probably a reusable form in these LLMs, as you mentioned, which actually probably in the future could serve well to do in terms of, R&D, to say the least, in improving patient outcomes, even perhaps potentially, maybe not in real time, but much faster. But, like starting now at the beginning, where one of the things you mentioned was, the beginning of pharmacogenetics, right? So, pharmacogenetics, and then you got this muscular skeletal focus. And I want to provide a moment where those two things intersect, where, I personally have felt, saw those two worlds come together. So actually on my way into getting a knee surgery, for example, I had the anesthesiologist come out and say, do you have any drug allergies? And my answer is always, I don't know, because I haven't tried them all, of course, right? But I had my own pharmacogenetics analysis done, and I took a look at the treatment plan. Actually, one of the things on my outpatient recommendation was going to be Celebrex. And as it turned out, I was a negative responder to that drug. So that was like a real time improvement on patient care. Now, what if we could get ahead of the whole, MSK issue, right? So I've had multiple surgeries. Why? Well, actually, this comes back to the insights from athletics and genetics. It's like, oh, well, your tissue is actually more vulnerable, based on the DNA research that we've seen, you have a higher risk for, MCL tears or, rotator cuff injuries, et cetera. And, that's supported, certainly by my genetic code and also my family history. So really interesting to get all of that data, in one place. And you mentioned these LLMs start to, apply these different forms of intelligence, these different layers of expertise. And you basically get to have this meta conversation with your data and yourself and your health through time, where you've got this N of one analysis that evolves as you experience life, and as the data becomes more informative. And I point to projects like, well, you said that there's the U.S. Veterans Project that's probably still bearing fruit. There's the All of Us project, for example. Like, one of the things they released, I think it was 2024, was like an updated, polygenic risk scoring to incorporate, greater ancestral diversity of, their top 10, right? So, amongst those that top 10 are the ailments that you had mentioned. So this might be, neurological decline. It might be cardiovascular health. It might musculoskeletal. Osteoporosis is one of the things that you mentioned. But, we kind of show up, born with this code, and, differentially, we have these different risks. And again, DNA is just a part of it. It's where do you find yourself in the environment, and then what are you doing to kind of exacerbate a risk or to avoid it. So you could imagine, this instance where everybody's landscape of health is known and considered, and we're each unique, let's say. And so the path to, say, avoiding some of these musculoskeletal injuries in the first place, maybe that becomes more clear. Of course, you're going to have, issue around, just acute trauma. That is probably, we're never going to be able to avoid that. But certainly moving into this more kind of well-care and preventative medicine, and, more agency, I think, in terms of being, let's say, the master over your own biology, so to speak. So yeah, really fascinating trajectory that you've, kind of mapped out for us. So starting with pharmacogenetics, it's like, oh, one drug, and now 200 plus into the future. You fast forward, and so here we are today. It's like, oh, one condition. Okay, we'll fast forward into the future. What may AI help facilitate in terms of decreasing risks of, these known human diseases, and then the confluence of DNA coming together, having to be more predictive and preventable. So quite, fascinating.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was a paper that came out fairly recently that showed you can use genetics to predict pain in back operations. And so basically, depending on your genetic profile, you can have the worst surgery done to you, and when you come out the other end, you have little or no pain. On the other hand, there are people who, ironically, because of their genetic code, can have the best and perfect back operation, but they're in severe pain for many, many weeks and months afterwards. And so that area is, genetics is pervasive in society anyway, and it's just going to get more and more. And AI is happening everywhere. And, there's a lot of skepticism from people who worry about AI. I just want to touch on this point in terms of regulatory and barriers, and, oh, we don't know, we don't understand AI, what are the guardrails being put in, and if you talk to someone like Eric Topol, he's going to say to you, well, we didn't know the mechanism of action of aspirin for, let's say, 70 years. However, it gave you a good outcome, right? It worked, but we didn't know how it works. And there's the same with many drugs. We don't know how they work, but if they give you a better outcome, then why not? As long as you pay attention to it and you learn from it. And I see that the same as with AI. So to me, I wanted to make this point. It's not, if medicine is going to use AI in the future and healthcare and in genomics, it's here to stay, and we have to grasp it. And it's going to help not only time saving in physicians, but also nurse practitioners. We're seeing them benefit. They love these tools as well, and the general health community. And AI is happening all over in medicine. And I'll give you another example. Even with Tempus, did a study with Geisinger a year or so ago, where they looked at EKGs of hundreds of thousands of EKGs. And if I look at my EKG and if I looked at yours, Jeremy, they're likely to look okay. However, if you multi-layer hundreds of thousands of them and use machine learning, it actually predicts the likelihood of AFib and stroke greater than 95%. So machine learning is going to be, and now that it's been FDA approved and it's gone through the system. So using tools like AI, you can diagnose your likelihood of a stroke far earlier. And also you can diagnose other things with EKGs, such as your likelihood of diabetes. And I know this sounds crazy, so I would recommend, if people haven't watched it, go Google YouTube, go to Eric Topol, to his 18-minute TED Talk, and you'll see the future of where AI and genomics and non-genomic tools are going in healthcare. So I just wanted to give Eric a shout out because I think it's an amazing talk he did.
Amazing. Well, something I'll maybe we can talk a little bit about this is, okay, we can look at the machine learning and then we can compare your EKG, or, we can compare your biomarkers indicative of type 2 diabetes, for example. And I think the important thing is to say or understand is, okay, based on the snapshot of today and your history and everything that you've done, this is your risk with 99% certainty. However, if you make this change, you can see this becoming de-risked. Because I think that's the thing that might be concerning to some people is like, well, I don't want to know that. It's like, well, actually, you do want to know that because you can do something about it. And I think that kind of pulls on the thread that you had mentioned previously about the direct to consumer industry and why it's so hard to be profitable there is, well, because I don't think people really. I mean, it's kind of fun for some hobbyists, biohackers, people who have done PhDs in molecular biology, such as yourself, such as me, to be like, oh, that's cool. But I think ultimately people are more interested in like how this becomes a compass and how it directs them to better health outcomes. It kind of similarly in the way to, if you consider like your GPS on your phone, right? You don't really care how it works, which satellites it pulls from, as long as it gets you to the right destination, right? Now, I think the challenge is the amount of trust that's required insofar as, well, this is my personal data, which is not a new problem, right? Because how you interact online and social media with your credit card, for example, that's, might be more intimate data than your DNA insofar as what it says about you as, behavior, at least behaviorally as a human, and what might be inferred from that. So, there is a, kind of a paradigm of, shift that I think has already happened in the next generation. Like the next generation is much more free with their personal information, for better or for worse, so just then, who are the, kind of powers that be that are using all this, for good. And let's just be clear, there's great, opportunity for good. And, I can tell you, Mark, we should have booked like a 3-hour conversation, and we're going to have to definitely have a follow-up because I want to see, where your business evolves. But I did want to hit on, kind of those 3 questions I mentioned in the outset, insofar as what's the key message that we need to get out based on what you're doing, insofar as embracing where you come from and where you see us going. So what are we saying? Who needs to see that, right? Or who needs to hear that, let's say. So let's start with that kind of 2-part question.
Okay, yeah. So I'll first start on one part of where I think a lot of this may be going. And you touched on polygenic risk score. To me, again, the genie's out of the bottle. That's happening. Genomics PLC is doing that. Where that adds value, again, clinical utility, is if you're in the top 5% or bottom 5% of any quartile on your risk for whatever disease, be it breast cancer, etc. And I've been asked that many years ago. A cardiologist at Emory approached me and said, Mark, have you got an array that can tell me, the likelihood of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, for example, and this, that, and the other? I know it's a risk, but it's incredibly clinically useful for me to know that. And some people in their lifestyles, I may have had a family history of heart disease where my uncles all died before the age of 40. Is that going to change my lifestyle? I don't know. But if my genes are telling me that, maybe I will change my lifestyle, kind of thing. So that's something these things are coming. They'll take time, because I tried to convey that pharmacogenetics, it's taken 2 to 3 decades for that really to be accepted. And for AI-based approaches in genomics, it may still take that length of time. The other thing I really want to touch on is the long read sequencing component, because we found out all this amazing information in genomics, but essentially, right, that's only on 1% of the genome, i.e. your genes. With long reads, I firmly believe that 99% or the dark matter, we'll learn so much more, and we've only really scratched the surface. And that's where the beauty of AI and machine learning comes in, because as I touched on earlier, whole genome sequencing is going to be a commodity. It's going to be quick to do, and pulling all that together with AI and ML and looking at structural variations, we're going to learn so much more about disease, susceptibility, risk, pharmacogenetics, and so on and so forth.
Amazing.
So,
So who needs to hear that to make it not
yes.
yeah.
Okay. So who needs to hear this? And that I'm not a politician. I'm not into politics. But right now, I would want to relate this or reach out to any incoming head of department of health of human services, be it RFK Jr. or whoever gets nominated, and they need to be convinced of how research around DNA will be central to all precision medicine in the next several decades. And they really need to be lobbied hard, because the main issue being discussed now, as I understand it in the government, is that grants are fundamentally broken in life science. So that needs to be looked at. These people need to hear it. RFK Jr. is saying that NIH-funded studies are problematic and would like to fix them by having Senate committees review proposals. Are they really the right people? He is looking at restructuring and maybe laying off NIH staff, and he wants to reduce infectious disease research while increasing chronic disease funding, which you can imagine that's happening. So I know that was a bit kind of political, but I think this applies to both sides of the aisle. And we really need the politicians to understand, and we need more people who can relate in a commons, in a lay person's way of why this is going to be so important and why it's going to save money over time, like in the way I've tried to discuss today.
Well, obviously the timing has a lot to do with it, but I've had a few folks on recently. Actually, I had Dr. Joel Handelsman on recently, who is a former scientific advisor to the Obama administration. So she's communicated her sentiments around genomics being at the center. I've had, some folks who are doing research at the Buck Institute on longevity analysis. It's all about precision data and N of one modeling. So there's a lot of conversation around, okay, how do we turn this very complicated, sophisticated, seemingly expensive, and seemingly a rudderless ship, into something that makes sense for politicians to understand. And there's a business case, and it makes economic sense to do this, because sometimes it's hard. We got researchers, innovators, people, really on the frontier, and it's hard to say for certain how will this pay off. I mean, the example I used is like Carrie Muller and dropping acid and going for a surf and coming up with the idea of PCR, and that's how we know DNA today. Right now, I'm not advocating that that's the model for a research grant, but what I am saying is there's a left brain, right brain, kind of synchrony, harmony that needs to happen, which is, it's a call for the right balance of basic research with the applied science, and to also have the checks and balances in place to make sure that we know what money wasting looks like, and then we also know what fruitful exploration could look like to discover a new world. Okay, so I hear you loud and clear. The last question is, who would you, and I think I have a sense of who that might be, because you've mentioned two Erics, but who might you nominate to be on the DNA of things?
Yeah, I thought about this a lot. I think I'm going to give you two names. I hate to say, hopefully that's okay. I would probably nominate someone who's been a pioneer in getting genetic testing into the clinic and has been involved. He basically was the founding chair of University of Chicago genetics department, and that is Dr. David Ledbetter. You may have come across David.
Okay.
David is, I know very well. He's the former CSO of Geisinger Health and has also worked in, as an advisor to many small companies. And so I think he would have an enriched palette of genetics, in particular rare genetic testing as well, because that's now coming to the fore. So that would be one. Or perhaps a good friend of mine, Dr. Brian Leyland Jones. And Brian is another Brit, I hate to say, but he's a world-renowned physician scientist, so MD, PhD kind of thing, who's an oncologist, and he was actually on the original Herceptin paper for treating breast cancer, so the first kind of pharmacogenetics thing. His depth of knowledge in the space of genetics, genomics, and oncology is second to none. Brian was chair of oncology at McGill. I got to know him and his research when he became director of the Winship Cancer Center at Emory in around about 2007, and we hit it off and we published some papers together, and we see eye to eye on a lot of things, and he's looking to develop new companies as a concierge for cancer patients, which is getting better all the time. But I think that's one of his areas of interest that he wants to do, and layer in genomics there as well. So those are the people I would, off the top of the head, I'd recommend. And if you want me to make any introductions, I'd be delighted to do so.
Oh, I would love that. And I'll follow up with you offline to do just that. But for today, Mark, thank you so much for everything you've done, you're continuing to do, and I'm sure will do for the industry of human health and performance and discovery and self-actualization. It was my absolute pleasure to be able to host you on the DNA of Things.
Yeah, absolute pleasure, Jeremy, and look forward to our interactions in the future. And because it's a small world, and the DNA, like I said, is pervasive in society, and we need more researchers in the space for sure.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. All right. The future isn't waiting to be invented. It's waiting to be remembered. A future where science listens, where systems serve, where suffering doesn't go unseen, and precision isn't a privilege, but a principle. What Dr. Mark Bouzyk shared today is more than a story. It's a signal that the data is here, the tools are ready, and the time for excuses is over. We've seen that what can happen when someone dares to build differently. Well, now we see the question is no longer, is this possible? The question is, will we make it personal? Will we build a system that starts not with symptoms, but with stories, not with scale, but with souls? You've seen the architecture of a better future, and now it's your turn to help lay the foundation. Thanks so much for listening. Till next time, stay curious, courageous, stay human. See you.